Kirk,
All right.
We're back.
Trevor. Yes, well, I'm not necessarily.
Yeah,
I'm back.
You're a long way away. So I know we won't
Yes.
we won't say exactly where you're in some hidden location, but you're a few
Yes.
hours north of us.
I am. What am I? I'm about an hour and a half, 2 hours north of Manitoba, Winnipeg. Yes, in northern Manitoba.
So good to have you on the phone, and so that's why Kirk sounds a little different today, but I'm sure he'll still be entertaining as always. So we're talking a little bit about the science. So when did we do this interview?
This episode, well, yes, we saved the first for last. And didn't we do the last for first in episode 1?
I think so.
So, yes.
We get a little backwards sometimes.
Dr. Namaka was our first interview, and I think it was October, November, and we saved him for the last because I think he kind of throws an envelope around everything, right? The way this neuroscientist, what's his title? He's a neuroimmunologist.
He's a neuroimmunologist, and he specializes in everything from MS to pain to, and he originally trained as a pharmacist, so I like that part.
Well, he's a local guy too, right? He talks about being from Winnipegosis, which is what, 45 minutes north.
45 minutes north of here, just around the corner.
Yeah. So we have another bright guy prepared to talk to us, and this was your interview. Trevor, this was a fabulous interview. I can remember walking away from this guy's interview and knowing some of what he was talking about, but not knowing it as well as he described it. I really liked the way he explained it to us. I thought he put it in layman's terms, and I think our listeners are going to enjoy this conversation you had with him.
I think so too. Now, before we get into it, though, I don't think we said, who are we again?
Oh, hey, Reefer MEDness, the podcast.
Reefer MEDness, the podcast. See us at reefermed.ca and some social medias.
On all that social media, that's right. They can find us on, Facebook. They can find us on Twitter, Instagram, SoundCloud.
Yeah, look for anything that says Reefer Med or Reefer MEDness on one of the social medias. We'll be there.
Yeah, and this is episode 5. I think we're agreed to call it The Scientist. So welcome listeners to episode 5.
Episode 5, and let's get into it.
Sure. Okay. So this was your gig, Trevor. So you were talking to this guy. Give him get a brief introduction of who this guy is.
Reefer MEDness, the podcast.
Dr. Namaka, how about you introduce yourself?
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to participate in the radio segment. I really appreciate that, especially given that I'm a homegrown Winnipegosis boy that grew up and went to school in Winnipegosis Collegiate. From there, I went on to University of Manitoba and then to Emory Medical University in Georgia. And at the end of the day, with all of that schooling, I wound up being a neuroimmunologist that studies and established expertise in diseases such as multiple sclerosis, chronic pain management, and how basically the immune system modulates inflammation and pain to affect those type of diseases. So
Dr. Namaka says our scientific understanding of cannabis of the brain is a really pretty recent phenomenon. Let's hear about that.
Yeah.
Well, right now, we really, have only just started, I think, to be fair, uncover the role of what cannabis does in the brain, because only back in 1964, which is 3 years prior to when I was born, that was the first time that we identified THC, or tetrahydrocannabinol, that we all know as pot or marijuana, as the main psychoactive ingredient from the cannabis sativa plant. So that's the first time it was there. When we're looking at our brain, we were only in 1988 were we able to identify for the very first time CB1 receptors, which are the receptors in our brain by which cannabinoids are thought to work at. And then in only 1992, we identified a second receptor called CB2 that was predominantly found not only in our brain, but predominantly in our peripheral nervous system, like outside of our brain and spinal cord, in other words. So to answer the question, what do we know about cannabis in the brain? we've only just really been starting to look at things for the past really 40 to 50 years. So it's relatively a new concept. And in fact, when we started to look at not only just the stuff that we get from the plant, we actually were able to see that in 1998, I'm just quoting a little bit of history to give everybody a little background on it, that we were able to identify the body had its own endogenous cannabinoid called anandamide. In other words, it is a substance within our body that helps us control pain, inflammation, and other aspects of our body, and it's called anandamide, that our body produces naturally, that is like identical or very similar to what we get from the external source of using medical marijuana. And since then, in addition to anandamide, they've identified other cannabinoids inside our body that work, such as this 2-AG or PEA. These are other acronyms that are used. So, to answer your question, what do we know about cannabis in the brain? Well, in the past 40 years, we were able to identify that the cannabis that we know works through certain receptors, and the fact that our own body produces our own endogenous cannabinoids. So it's got to be there for a reason to do something hopefully beneficial for us in terms of disease management.
That's fascinating. Just how recent it's all been. I'm just thinking that I was literally out of pharmacy school and working before they were finding the endogenous cannabinoids. So, well, for old people like me, it seems like it was just yesterday. Yeah,
well, as we said earlier, Trevor, Dr. Namaka sort of started both of us on our research. And in some of the research I've been doing, I read someplace, and again, I gotta find the paper I read it in, but the hemp plant, the cannabis plant, is older than Homo sapiens, right? So Dr. Namaka speaks about the endocannabinoid system in our bodies, right? That how we have evolved with this system, but yet this system is sort of connected to a plant that's older than we are. So it makes me wonder, what came first, the cannabis plant or the human? And I guess what I'm reading is that the hemp plant came first, right? So how does that relate to what he was saying? He was talking about cannabinoids in us, and he was talking about another substance, anandamide.
Yeah, the anandamide. That's there's probably lots, but we think that anandamide is at least one of the cannabinoids that our body produces itself.
Right. So and this is all stuff that I wonder. So we evolved. Did our species as humans, did we evolve to have this plant as part of our life?
Well, and I've heard this argument before. In fact, I'm sure one of my friends who liked to partake in high school, that was always his argument for using. But I think that's stretching it a bit. So all the plant-based medicines kind of work this way. So foxglove produces digitalis, which is a poison. But if we give it in the right amounts, it helps the heart pump more strongly and regularly. And that's the basis of the heart drug digoxin. And then there are the opioids. We have opioid receptors all over our body. That's why morphine's such a good painkiller. But does that mean that we evolved to use opium, morphine, and fentanyl and all their chemical cousins?
I don't know. I don't know if I've ever read an article that said that opiate plants came before Homo sapiens did. But someone's done the research to say that the hemp plant, the cannabis plant, has been around long.
Well, no, you might have a point, but
I don't know. I mean, I'm just going by what I've read, right? And I'm asking questions. This whole podcast was you and I asking questions.
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely.
And I think, and I'm sorry to interrupt because I'm on the phone here. We can't read each other's faces. But I guess I think about the question I asked in episode 0 there. That I said, is cannabis always medicine? And I think Dr. Namaka pretty much does that. I think he supports my argument that even when people are using non-medicinal cannabis, because of the science, I think they're actually using it as medicine.
I disagree, but before we get into that, because I think that'll be an ongoing thing here, I asked him, Dr. Namaka, about what we could use cannabis to treat, And he got to that, but first you need to do a bunch of clarifications.
Right. Well, first of all, I just want to back up a little bit before we jump into what we can use it for, is that we have to make sure that when we are speaking of medical marijuana or medical cannabinoids and the use for these diseases, that type of nomenclature determines the fact that we need a medical healthcare expert, a pharmacist, a physician, a nursing staff, other people that are involved in a multidisciplinary nature to make sure that the patients are protected by ensuring that they are the ones that are receiving the product that they actually need for medicinal purposes, and that the product we're sending to them is regulated, prescribed, obtained from licensed producers, in my mind, rather than, a corner store that may not have the same regulatory storage requirements and other things to safeguard our patients. So that's just, stepping back a bit before I get into, addressing, some of the ailments. And so when we look at, some of the different ailments, again, I'm going to put another disclaimer before I get into that. We have to realize that the concept of medical marijuana, although it's new, and although there's social stigmas and personal stigmas and societal stigmas associated that may be associated with its use, the drug nevertheless or the medicine that we believe is coming from these plants is being distributed on the market that is approved by Health Canada by the 29 to 35 licensed producers across Canada.
Reefer MEDness.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? Even our brain scientist here talks about the stigma involved with cannabis. And isn't that something that you and I have stumbled into in our research and and doing this? How many times how many times I've had conversations with people about our podcast, and how many times I've stumbled into people's stigma and their rudimentary understanding of cannabis.
Oh, I agree. And it's been fascinating to me. And I wouldn't have even thought of this, but, I've even run into just business people who said, I was kind of thinking about getting into whether it's growing or opening a shop or something. Said, but there's no way I could do that. Basically they're saying there's too much stigma involved. So even with it being legalization around the corner, so whether it's using medicinally or in business wise, stigma seems to be all over the place.
Well, I think I shared this story early in it, but I was taking my car to my mechanics, and I was talking about our podcast, and he said, "Oh, cannabis is going to be illegal." He wasn't following the news. And I said, "Yeah, cannabis is going to be legal in the summer." And he goes, "Oh, well, I've never done it before, but gee, maybe I'll give it a try." I'm thinking, well, go for it, I guess. But it was just interesting, his response to it, that if it becomes legal, then maybe I'll give it a try.
I think one of the things we can agree on, stigma seems to be all over cannabis, both sides, medicinal, non-medicinal.
Yeah, I think so too. I think that's one of the saving graces. When it's legalized and it becomes normalized, then maybe the stigma can be downgraded a little bit. But then again, there are still people that have stigma against drinking alcohol too. So I guess it's going to be there.
It'll be there a while.
So we first have to come to realize that although based on our conventional medicine that we get for high blood pressure, cholesterol, diabetes, a lot of those medications have went through preclinical testing in animals, then human clinical trials, phase 1 to phase 4 trials to get onto the market, for example. In the case of medical marijuana, the drug has been approved by the government for sale and distribution to humans before we had the preclinical and clinical evidence in the degree of strength that we would have needed in order for them to be considered for these particular indications that you've indicated, like pain, nausea, seizures, MS, and so forth. So that's just another disclaimer that I just wanted to, respond as well.
Oh, fair enough. So what do we think the cannabis might be able to treat, and what's probably not reasonable?
Well, we have to go back to my little introduction at the beginning. When we look at the distribution of the receptors by which cannabis would work in the body, because in order for cannabis to work, it has to bind to a receptor, and that receptor gives you an effect that can be positive or negative to help disease or hinder diseases. And so what we do know when we look at the distribution of CB1 and CB2 receptors by which cannabinoids bind to exert their effects, we see that CB1 receptors are predominantly located in the central nervous system. That includes really your brain and your spinal cord. And that's like your powerhouse for everything that controls pain, especially a lot of pain pathways, other pathways, that determines, whether or not diseases kind of go on or go off. In very simplistic terms, CB2 receptors are largely found in the periphery, outside of the brain and spinal cord, and they kind of regulate the immune system and inflammation. So when you understand the distribution of these receptors, and you can see that the medications, the cannabinoids that bind to CB1 receptors, for example, may be more efficacious for pain and things like epilepsy or seizures, for example, because those involve the central nervous system, which include the brain and spinal cord. On the other side, there's other for inflammation like rheumatoid arthritis, osteoarthritis, things like that. Those medications may be also beneficial because of the anti-inflammatory or immune system suppression or modification effects that we believe that cannabinoids have. So there is potential, but again, I err with caution that we need to do the preclinical and the clinical trials to gain the support for what we believe the beneficial effects of these medications will have.
Okay, so now we're going to argue about clinical trials because honestly...
Well, it's interesting that you say we're going to argue about clinical trials because I don't disagree with the needs of clinical trials. But sometimes I think the whole cannabis issue, how many times have I been in conversation with you said, well, we're going too fast. We're moving too fast. People aren't ready for this. And I'm not sure if we're ready for it or not. But I think the clinical trials are very important because that is what we as practitioners work on. When things are working, we do trials to prove that it worked. But one of the things that I always go back to is that when they built this great railway across Canada, they didn't finish the railway and then start the train from Ottawa to Vancouver, right? If you look at it, they had the locomotive right beside where they were building it. So the locomotive went up until they were building it, and it moved, and it moved, and it moved. So you built the railway as the locomotive followed it. So sometimes I think medicine sometimes, Trevor, is an art form as much as a science. And I think cannabis, in my experience, in the interviews I've had and the talking to the patients, I think when we're looking at cannabis, we might be looking at the art of medicine, and I think the science will follow it. Like the train, the locomotive followed them building the tracks.
No, and you could be right, but it's, at the very least, it's bass backwards from what we do from just about everything else. Like
But is it though?
But if we discover if we discover a compound, a chemical that we think might have sort of pharmaceutical worth, the usual, I'm not saying, and because this is not what's going on with cannabis, the usual is to discover it, have some pharmacological reason why it might be a good thing, start testing it in, small things like rats and rabbits and see if it does anything good, and then eventually make its way up to preclinical and clinical trials in humans. And that's just...
Are you saying that happens all the time?
I'm saying that's usual. Now, I would be completely disingenuous if I said that we haven't done a lot of off-label drug use everywhere. So for those of you, off-label basically means a drug gets an indication for something. So let's say it's a really good blood pressure pill. But we find as a weird side effect, it gives people erections. And so then they go, okay, well, let's use this off-label to treat erectile dysfunction. Like that happens all the time, and we just call it off-label
use. Which drug
use.
does that? Which drug does that?
You're admitting a problem on the air? So, yes, off-labels.
No, okay, no, here's an example. Let's talk about gabapentin. Was gabapentin originally used for pain management?
No.
Okay,
it was originally seizure medication and doesn't work particularly well at that.
So how did physicians start using it for pain management?
Were
there clinical studies done first, or did they discover the art of the drug?
No, the art of the drug. This was definitely an off-label thing.
So tell me why. You work with physicians as much as I do, and maybe more so because you work within an environment of the medicine model, the medical model. Why is it that family physicians are having such a tough time with cannabis?
I think it goes back to stigma. Now, I'm not going to argue we don't need more study, but...
I'm not arguing that either, Trevor. I think we need more studies.
But I agree. I'm torn. I guess what I'm saying is I'm torn because you and I both see a patient who's got, condition X. We give them a drug. It gets better. It gets worse. And we either change the drug or not. And that's a one-off study. And we do that all day. That's part of what we both do. And,
right.
So you could argue that's exactly what's been going on with cannabis now. I guess should it be, I guess, is where I get torn.
Well, the other thing that I found interesting in our episode 2 of Reefer MEDness, the podcast, for those listeners that haven't listened to episode 2, when we were speaking to our patients, none of them are being studied. So here we have physicians that are using, and we've been using medicinal marijuana and medicinal cannabis since 2001, right? 2001, 2002?
Yeah, about that.
We were the first country in the world, by the way, to be countrywide to be using medicinal cannabis. That's another thing I've read since we did that episode. But none of the people we interviewed, none of them are being studied. So that bothers me. So we hear family doctors that are saying that they don't want to prescribe this because we don't have enough studies, but yet we're using it, and the people that are using it aren't being studied. So I'm wondering, is that part of the stigma? So when legalization happens, will it be easier to get those studies to happen?
I would hope so. And you know what? I think, Doc, I'm going to interrupt because we'll go on for this one forever. I think we'll listen to Dr. Namaka, and because, he's actually involved in running trials, and see what he has to say.
To answer the big $1 million question, is if we believe these things work, then the licensed producers that are out there should be investing money to, again, confirm that they work, right? That you would think that would be the case. And there are licensed producers that are out there that are investing money, that do believe in their particular product that they have, because these licensed producers are able to genetically modify the plants now to confirm certain ratios of the THC, that active component that we all know that gives you the high in marijuana use, CBD, which is cannabidiol, which is a medication that we're finding more and more, or a component of the plant that's finding more and more beneficial in pain management, inflammation, as well as there's other forms or types of molecules that we're just recently identifying that are coming out of this plant mixture per se, that have medicinal or could be potentially medicinal properties to help in these conditions.
Oh, that's great. So let's switch gears a little bit and go to young people in cannabis. We hear about this a lot. The federal government, the provincial government have been throwing around this number a lot, that the brain is still developing up till age 25. So, there shouldn't be any cannabis use in people under 25. But on the other hand, we have case studies of really young children who have serious seizure disorders and many, seizures an hour, who seem to be helped by CBD. So let's start with, is it true, as far as we know, that the brain is still developing up to age 25?
Well, believe, first of all, again, just before I get into answer the question, you have to take a step back. We have to ensure that we're speaking about the medicinal use, not recreational use.
Fair enough.
So when we're talking about medicinal use and we're talking about children with these, status epilepticus or other major seizure disorders that are every few minutes, the brain is getting bombarded with this hyperexcitability of cortical neurons in your head until, that's triggering this seizure. The brain is still developing up to the age of 25, and I think it's developing up to the age of 50 because I'm still expanding my knowledge synapses to keep learning more about different areas. But the bottom line is that it all comes down to risk-benefit. And again, back to the distribution of the receptors. When you're looking at the cannabinoid receptors, unlike opioid products, cannabinoid receptors are not found in the brain's medulla area, which is the area of the brain that controls our breathing. So because of that, when we administer cannabinoids, in part, because it doesn't affect the respiratory system or suppress the respiratory system like we know with the opioids overdose and the opioid crisis that's going on, they can be more safer to use as not mainstay treatment, but I think adjunctive treatment to conventional medicine that's already out there for these particular conditions that have been tried and true.
I'm just going to highlight an important bit here because it keeps coming up. Everyone's talking about the opioid crisis we're in, and one of the biggest problems with opioids is during an overdose of opioids, the part of the brain that controls breathing gets suppressed, and if a person stops breathing, they can die. Dr. Namaka is saying we haven't found any cannabinoid receptors in the medulla part of the brain that controls breathing. So we don't get any breathing suppression in an overdose of cannabis. That should make cannabis much safer than opioids.
So when we're looking at that whole segment, you also, in addition to the breathing thing, in addition to using these, I believe the use of medical marijuana or cannabinoids can be used as adjunctive to conventional medicine that's tried and true. We also need to look at the patient, each patient specifically, and determine the risk-benefit in that patient. And I will tell you that if you have seen a patient with status epilepticus that has seizures repeated over and over and over, one behind the other without stopping, there is huge risk associated with those people with intractable seizures like that to have permanent brain damage because of the hyperexcitability or overactivity of your brain that you can't shut off. It's no different than you jumping in your vehicle and leaving it in park and revving your vehicle, the accelerator, right to the max for about 30 to 40 minutes and seeing if that's going to impact your motor. It sure will. So the point I'm trying to make is that when you ask a general question of should we be considering the use of cannabinoids, for example, as adjunctive medications for patients that are younger, that may have intractable seizures, status epilepticus, and other life-threatening type of medical conditions, I would probably answer that it probably would be beneficial, because if we don't try anything on these people and the conventional medicine is not working enough to control them, we will be leaving these people permanently with deficits that we could have tried at least.
Oh, that's fantastic, and thanks for breaking down the nuance on that. My co-host Kirk works as a nurse on Northern Reserves and sees a whole lot more of these things firsthand than I do. And yes, he's experienced patients with status epilepticus, and yeah, from a clinician's point of view, it's pretty scary. And you can see from the way you explained it how that could certainly lead to permanent damage. And if there's anything we can do to reduce the seizures, then, like everything else in pharmacy and medicine, we risk the benefits versus the risks and go from there.
Yeah, and the other thing I wanted to mention, Trevor, too, is that we have to realize that everybody is still in the societal misconception that when you think of marijuana, you think of THC. I want to just step back again and realize that the new licensed products that are coming out have various ratios of THC to CBD. And in fact, the research is supporting that there's more, just as you've indicated earlier, more benefit from some of the non-psychoactive ingredients like CBD and other forms of active ingredients that are in this plant extract that we have yet to determine. So although we equate medical marijuana with THC and the euphoric high that we got of love, peace and war, in the 60s and 70s, right now we are genetically altering these plants to lower the psychoactive ingredient to a level that is tolerable to patients, that doesn't drive dependence issues, that doesn't drive tolerance issues, and we're beefing up more of the other ingredients in there that don't have those negative societal and personal attributes from the plant extract, which we now know through what's called the entourage effect. That means that there's numerous molecules and chemicals within this plant extract, maybe from the stem, maybe from the leaf, maybe from, the resin that we get from them, but all of which we can adjust the ratios consistently with a good licensed producer of it. And we're not dealing with just high-dose THC and developing the child's brain. We're looking at it at a much more refined medicinal approach that is mirroring the conventional medicine that's out there.
It's Reefer MEDness, the podcast.
So Trevor, we've been reading about the entourage effect, and I got to tell you that this was the first time I had heard this terminology being used when Dr. Namaka talked about this. And it also keeps coming up in our reading. And it's a funny thing. It's sort of like, I guess, when I eat an apple, I get certain vitamins from it, and I get sort of roughage from the apple. Or I can just go and get, or even an orange would be better. I can eat an orange and get the roughage from it and get the whole food. Or I can get a vitamin C tablet. So I'm wondering about what do we know about companies who are extracting parts of the cannabis plant?
Yeah, I don't know. It's a short answer, and I don't think anyone does. But it was interesting this coming from Namaka because, depending on where you read, there's hundreds, maybe thousands of medicinally active compounds in cannabis. And just the term entourage effect implies that they work as a team. And perhaps that team works better than the extracted components. So, I guess for something that keeps coming up is, does that mean like a low THC, high CBD whole flower might be better than just an extracted CBD oil?
Mm-hmm. And again, we need to do the studies on this, right? And it gets the terpenes as well, right? The whole thing about
we haven't even touched on terpenes.
I know we got to start doing the terpene of the month, terpene of the day. Those are fascinating. That when we start doing those interviews, but did Dr. Namaka got into some interesting points and pearls that we can offer clinical prescribers when they're ordering cannabis, right? So what does he say about that?
Let's listen.
Right. Well, the producer is a producer that's involved in producing a product. You have to go to the healthcare professionals that have been involved, I think, with some of the use of the product in actual patients that come to our respective clinics. And in general, we have a general idea of the patients that we put on these medical marijuana or medical cannabinoids from the different licensed producers for pain. And we've had some, anecdotally, good effects and bad effects from some people, but most of the effects have been pretty good in regards to pain management. Our group as well has, published the use of a synthetic cannabinoid, nabilone, for example, that we often use for patients with cancer as an anti-nauseant because of the chemotherapy. And we have determined efficacy of a synthetic cannabinoid in helping the pain and the immune system in people that had neuropathic pain when it was used as an adjunctive to another common medication for neuropathic pain, which you're aware of, is gabapentin. And we published that. So that was kind of the first step that we said, hey, I think that there should be some merit in the use of cannabinoids in conditions such as pain. So I can speak to that not only just from my own personal thoughts, but from peer review publication that we've put together on a clinical trial that demonstrates that the synthetics work. So if the synthetics work, we often use as a guideline, as people that look after patients that have these conditions, we may often try patients on nabilone, for example, to see if the person is responsive to that cannabinoid-like material for pain, for spasticity, for other things that we may feel that it's deemed appropriate. If the person generally responds well in a positive direction on nabilone, the synthetic conventional medication, albeit it's used off-label for this, that we use it, but we've published it, we then once you reach a certain, breaking point, the nabilone may not be enough to carry on and help these people with the pain management. So the next tier or logical transition would be to possibly suggest patients to use medical cannabinoids. And it doesn't really matter, which company that is out there, as long as they're a licensed producer and they meet all the requirements on them. I know that it's important that they meet all of those. And when we start, usually when we're looking at pain, we always go with the start low and go slow kind of formulation. And I like to always try, for example, a product that is low in THC, because obvious the psychoactive components that we spoke of earlier.
Okay.
And higher in CBD, so say a 1 to 20 formulation, for example. It could be different ratios with different companies, so I'm just, picking one, non-discriminately. So if we did a 1 to 20 formulation and say you came in and you seen me and we had to put you, we decided that you'd be a good candidate for the use of medical cannabinoids, we would start you on a formulation like 1 to 20, 1 part THC, 20 parts CBD. I would prefer to use an oral formulation. That's our own preference. Now there's oral oils, there's capsules that have a milligram content in them as well. The inhaled vaporization is also okay, but I'm not a supporter of smoking medical marijuana due to obvious health risks, of why we counsel all of our patients to stop smoking to begin with.
No, and I think that's an important point. Just, I know we've got 2 or 3 patients in our various care homes on medicinal marijuana, and just 2 or 3 years ago, they stopped letting the residents there smoke at all. So not surprisingly, they weren't a real big fan of us bringing in smokable medicinal marijuana or even the inhalers. The nurses thought it'd be too complicated. So it definitely went to the oral oil in that case.
Right. And the benefit of using, say, a vaporizer is that when you take the medical marijuana and you put it into the vaporizer, it doesn't make it combustible to get the carcinogenic or cancer-causing agents that are there. You're just aromatizing the medicine into the air and breathing it in without causing combustion. That's why vaporization is safer than actual smoking. But right now, because I practice on using conventional medicine, my own personal preference is to use the oral oils or the oral capsules from whichever licensed producers that are involved in those, because for me they're a little easier to titrate. Okay, and now getting back to say some of what dose do we go? Where do we start? I think that was a question that you had earlier. Right?
Absolutely.
If you'd like me to kind of address that, just, is that fine?
Yeah, absolutely. That's perfect.
So when someone comes in and I determine that they're on conventional medicines already for their pain, we first do a variety of pain assessments to determine that, hey, we've kind of capped out on maximizing the conventional medicine that their doctor normally would prescribe. Opioids, analgesics, other things like that. And then we decide that with a trial of nabilone, the person's acceptable and they have no other, contraindications to using the medical cannabinoid product from a licensed producer. We put them on it. We put them on it starting with the 1 to 20 formulation, for example. And we start dosing anywhere from a quarter or 250 milligrams to 0.5 grams per day, okay? And we do that dose for a week. So if you came in and you said, hey, depending on what stage of chronic pain you were in, say you had very high pain, you tried a bunch of conventional medicine, you're still on conventional medicine, we're not proposing that cannabinoids are going to replace or make you get off of the conventional medicine, but we are looking that maybe this cannabinoids can actually help as a synergistic effect to conventional medicine to help take an additional edge off these people with chronic pain. So we often would start in that type of a person with 0.5 grams of an oil or an oral formulation, a capsule, whatever the milligram capsules come in, and we would then divide that 0.5 grams into two doses. So in other words, 250 milligrams in the morning and 250 milligrams in the evening, okay?
Okay.
And we would keep a person on that dose for about a week to 2 weeks to determine every day, they'd take it twice a day on how they're feeling. And we would ask them, basically, and it's a simple assessment that patients can be involved in their care with their doctors on a scale of 0 to 10 based on what's standardly accepted. It's a qualitative visual analog scale where 0 is no types of discomfort associated with your neuropathic pain and 10 is incapacitating. Where would you rate your pain? And people that report a pain of greater than 5 still require medical management, because the reality is, like for MS, like for some seizures, like for chronic pain, we don't have a cure for these. So at best, we're able to use them, all the medicines in our tool cabinet that we have, to reduce the pain or discomfort to a more tolerable level that does not interfere in your normal daily activities. So we start with the low THC content because we don't want to have people with that stoned effect or the, glazed over effect, where you're cognitively really impaired, because that is no good either. And we want to slowly build up some tolerance in our patients. So we start with, the 120 formulation, and we go at 0.5 gram titrations for approximately every 2 weeks, okay, or as tolerated by the patient. This is just a general titration. It does not apply to everyone. You may have to go slower. You may have to go half of that amount. But we eventually, most people from our professional experience respond to treatment between 1 to 3 grams per day in the divided doses.
Cool.
And some people may even need to divide the dose to 3 times a day, depending on how they're, like the daily dose 3 times a day, depending on where and how their pain presents. So to give you an idea, we would be titrating by 0.5 grams approximately every couple of weeks to a dose which we believe is a therapeutic dose between 1 and 3 grams per day in divided doses. Okay.
Eventually, I do want to get on to MS, but first, can you do just a quick run through for us the difference between medicinal marijuana or medicinal cannabis and nabilone? Like what's the difference between the synthetic and what we would get from a licensed producer?
Well, the synthetic product that is out there that I said is used off-label, that means it doesn't have an indication for pain, but it's used for pain. No different than aspirin is used for fever. We always knew about it. Now it's used for cardiovascular protection. So when we look at nabalone, it's a synthetic product. That means that we use medicinal chemistry to prepare a product that looks like our body's own endogenous cannabinoids that I spoke of, the anandamide and other ones that are in our body. We prepare those medicines synthetically because we're hoping that they will have a higher binding affinity to those CB1 and CB2 receptors that I spoke of to ultimately affect how the drug works in our body.
Yeah. So he starts talking about nabalone, Trevor, and our patient Kale is a man who used nabalone, and it's interesting that the synthetic cannabinoids, synthesized cannabinoids, are needs more studies as well, but yet we're using it.
Yeah. Its only indication right now is for nausea, but doctors have no. I guess again we're back to stigma. They have no stigma about using nabalone. Just try it out for pain. And our little N of 1 study, KO, he used it and was pretty happy with it. So
he was reasonably happy with it, but I've talked to him since, and he's not so happy with it. It's not necessarily working as well as he thought, right? So we have to return to KO at some point and talk to him about his experiences with the nabalone. But it's just interesting, when you talk. I mean, we're doing this as clinical practitioners. Reefer MEDness, the podcast, is two professionals, healthcare professionals, who are talking about cannabis. And we have to be very careful. And we said this before, as practitioners, we can't be seen as promoting cannabis.
We don't promote cannabis.
No, we can't promote. We're not allowed to promote cannabis as practitioners, right? But we can talk about it and we can educate on it. And that's what we're trying to do. So when I look at nabalone, and and you talk to the people who are, quote unquote, the green culture, is nabalone not a perfect example of big pharma trying to create something that Mother Nature already has?
Well, without getting myself into trouble, yeah. Well, it sure seems that way. But
I threw a curveball.
yes, you did, but that's okay. So no, but at the very least, I guess how I like to think about it is it's an entry drug for our family physicians, because they don't usually have any qualms about if everything else has failed and they want to try something different, to try nabalone first before they start talking about medicinal cannabinoids. But
that's probably because it came through the system that they recognize, right?
Right.
It came through the pharmaceutical companies. They recognize that system. Doctors practice medicine. The pharmaceutical companies provided a new medicine. Here's a medicine.
No, I think you're absolutely right. That one I can't disagree with. Let's get back to Namaka and see what he's talking about, the differences between nabalone and cannabis.
So to answer your question, I can't tell you how exactly nabalone will compare to the genetically altered plant material extract, because we haven't done that type of study with all the licensed producers and all the different, strains and so forth of product that they produce through this genetically altered process to determine the binding affinity and clinical or therapeutic effect of that drug compared to nabalone. Those are studies that still need to be done, Trevor. So we need to do a head-to-head study of where we put nabalone as an adjunctive to conventional medicine against, for example, a plant-derived extract to the, as adjunctive medication to the same thing. We also have to realize that when we look at medications that you're familiar with as well, like digoxin, for example, that's helped with congestive heart failure and other cardio conditions, that medication was derived, like other things, from a plant, right? And no different than opium from a plant. So we can't be skeptical of what is coming from a plant, because aspirin was also developed from a birch tree, or like the bark of a birch tree. So there's different things that we have to look back and realize that we can't give you the answer of a direct comparison between a synthetic and a plant-derived. My gut instinct would be that maybe the plant product, because of this entourage effect, not only because it has THC, CBD, and other components, it's the other hodgepodge of material that's in that plant extract that makes it better when they're all together than each independent component that we know of, that we think we know of right now. that we're trying to titrate it to. To answer your question, I don't think we know, but I do believe that the entourage of other active ingredients within the plant extract may be way better than any synthetic product that's out there that's focusing just on one or two components like THC, CBD, and their binding effect, when in fact maybe we needed the trace element of something else in the plant extract that make it work better.
Oh, that's fantastic. And I would really be amiss with all the research you've done to not talk about MS and cannabis. So I know you've done research with cannabinoids and nabalone and MS and MS pain. So how about because we've got lots of them in the parkland areas, how about what do we know about cannabis and multiple sclerosis?
Well, when we had, I think that I'll start with a conclusion before I start with an explanation. I believe from my own personal experience and my research expertise, I believe that medical cannabinoids would potentially have a place in select patients that have multiple sclerosis, because MS patients also have pain. They also have an overactive immune system that is destroying their myelin coating, that's causing a lot of the symptomatic issues like spasticity, pain, walking abilities, other things like that. And because there's reports and research that's previously been done, and the research that we're also involved with, all of these things are suggesting more and more that cannabinoids are able to not only help with, suppressing pain, but they're also able to, and we don't know the answers to, how, but they're also able to modulate or modify the immune system, of which MS patients may get benefit from. Because if you have an overactive immune system and the patients are also in pain, we know that if cannabinoids are able to kind of suppress that inflammation and pain side of things and alter the immune system to suppress it a little bit, that can also have a beneficial effect in patients with multiple sclerosis. So although our published study that we did with nabalone as an adjunctive to gabapentin in MS patients proved that the drug did work, the synthetic cannabinoid did work to help with pain in that particular study. It also, we noted, helped with the MS, but we weren't sure how. And that's where some of the research, preclinical and clinical research I'm embarking on now, that are trying to set up so that we can, do a societal responsibility and try to answer or publish some of our work that will, from the University of Manitoba, that will actually speak to, for example, do these agents work? How do they work? It's more than just binding to a CB1 or CB2 receptor. What is the exact pathways, molecular pathways they work, so that we can put it in the same order of evaluation by which we have established conventional medicine guidelines from, so that we know if you're giving cholesterol medication, it affects its cholesterol pathway. We need to do the same type of research right now in medical cannabinoids, so that we can move forward with these million-dollar questions, where we're seeing all these anecdotal reports that you speak of as well, but we have to prove that how they're working. And that's still just going to be, all of this stuff is just starting to be involved, and I'm happy to, be working with a very strong team of people here that have similar interests to try to answer that particular question.
Oh, that's fascinating. And honestly, this is the first time I've heard good explanations about why, even if we don't know exactly how, but why we think, because like you said, MS is an autoimmune disease. The immune system's doing bad things to the myelin sheath around the nerves. So, it might be the CB2 receptors, or it might be something else, but there really is some evidence that cannabinoids are doing something to the immune system, and that's fascinating. That's a cool place for it to go.
that we have to look at, and I'm presently looking at that, and we'll be coming out hopefully with a publication in the next few months that will look at, for example, an animal model of multiple sclerosis and the effects of some of these medications at a molecular level, so that we can see or answer that burning question that we all have as clinicians and healthcare providers. It's not enough to just say that we think it's working. We need to prove that it's working, that it's affecting things at the gene and protein level, at the molecular grassroots that are changing, by why the person in your office or that comes to your pharmacy is telling you that they're having beneficial effects on pain, spasticity, post-traumatic stress, epilepsy, other conditions that, these medical cannabinoids are thought to be beneficial in.
Thank you very much. Now, before we wrap, because I know it's come up in both my college, who gives me a license every year, and Kirk's college, College of Nursing, both of them have thrown this quote at us that there is no evidence that cannabinoids or cannabis is useful in medicine and helping people. If, I happen to be in a room with, say, my registrar, what would you have me tell them?
Well, I would tell them what the story that I've really described is, that we have only been in the cannabinoid research field realistically starting from the time it's been, licensed, where the licensed producers are, the horse has left the barn. The drug is already in the human population for being used medicinally. So, one, because it's legislated already for that, we have to step up and acknowledge that we have to safeguard the public. So we have to continue the research that we're doing. I've indicated for the last 50 years, we've only just established the receptors and other things and the endogenous cannabinoids that we've identified. We have to continue looking at molecular pathways and doing research to identify mechanisms. And for the regulatory bodies and licensing bodies of the various healthcare providers, we have to realize that if we don't have a cure for things like pain or multiple sclerosis or epilepsy, we have to look to alternative treatment approaches to try and help our patients and do a societal responsibility to determine their place in therapy. And the fact that we have more cannabinoid receptors anywhere in our body than opioid receptors and other things, we have thousands of years with opioids in terms of knowledge. We've only have less than 100 with cannabinoids. So this is coming. It is not going to go away. We will find the answers we're looking for, and we have to be proactive and be prepared, because I would rather have, for example, pharmacies involved in the direct distribution of the medicine than going down in the corner store where somebody doesn't have the proper storage, regulation, patient best interests, of follow-up and judicious administration of quantities and follow-up that pharmacy always does with the patients, with their physicians, to safeguard everybody in this process. The bottom line, it's coming, and I believe we have to move forward and embrace that and figure out that how best we are going to accept what's already left the building.
Dr. Namaka, it's been a fascinating talk. Thank you very much for letting us get into your busy schedule. Thanks a lot. That was fantastic.
To reach out and say a big hello to my father, William Namaka, out in Winnipegosis, and to everybody else that's out there that supported my career and involvement, all my teachers, and everybody out there that from a little collegiate, it's pretty nice to realize that a homegrown kid can actually gain the knowledge and expertise that you've acquired and other people have acquired from small towns. So kudos to everyone out there in the educational services that gave us a foundation to provide us with this ability to shape our career and hopefully shape the way people are looked after in the healthcare profession.
That was really nice. Thank you.
Have a good day, guys.
Trevor, I really enjoyed his interview. I often drive long distances, and when I'm not listening to podcasts or talking books, I'm listening to our interviews just to reacquaint myself to them. And I listened to Dr. Namaka couple weeks back, driving down home from the north, and I really enjoyed it. I think he pretty much nails it. Cannabis is medicine all the time.
Well, I really like Namaka as well. It's fantastic local boy, made good. And, he speaks really intelligently about the different parts of the plant and what we know and what we don't. Cannabis is medicine. I still struggle with that. I know that's getting to be your mantra, but I don't think I'm giving anything away. I'm not a regular cannabis user. I never have been. So, but I think of it, my drug of choice, I guess, is alcohol. And, yes, you could argue that if I go home and have a beer after a hard day, I'm, self-medicating myself. But, on the other hand, if I'm watching a hockey game on the TV, sometimes I'm just having a beer because I like having a beer. And I can't see why that wouldn't be different with someone non-medicinally or recreationally using cannabis. I think they could just be using it because they like how it makes them feel. And, in a few months, that's going to be legally just fine.
Well, and I declared in episode 0 that I am of my demographic. I have been around street drugs for most of my life. I started when I was 6 years old, and not that I was a street drug user, of course, but it was in my household because my parents were foster parents, and we had foster children in the 60s that were problem children, and they ended up in my home. And then, of course, in nursing in small towns, you go to the bar, you go to hockey games, you hang out with people, and cannabis has been part of our culture for an awfully long time. And in nursing, I've been involved with the cannabis culture, and I have friends from high school that were in the cannabis culture, and I have some friends from high school that were incredibly successful people. They are incredibly successful people. One of the guys, actually, Trevor, one of these guys is a fellow that builds weather buoys, and he gave me a statistic on how many mixed drinks we can make with the solar panels that we have on our roofs.
You love this stat. You brought this up before. Tell me, Kirk.
Yes.
How many margaritas are you making with the stuff you're making, the electricity you're making from your sexy roof?
Well, gee whiz, now I got to go. Now I'm unprepared. I got to find the reference.
But it was a lot.
It was a lot. I'm making a lot of margaritas from the solar panels that I see now. Isn't that funny? We can talk about alcohol, and I'm making margaritas. But if I was saying I was growing plants in my basement, that would be Stigma.
Right.
I'm not growing plants in my basement. Right. I'm just using it as an example. But yes, we have these sexy roofs thanks to Evolve Green, who is one of our sponsors.
Evolve Green sponsors Reefer MEDness. You should visit them as well.
They should. Evolve Green. They're a Manitoba company. They helped us with episode 1, 3, and 5.
So we don't quite agree whether or not cannabis is always medicine, but I think interesting things popped up is stigma. I think we can both agree that stigma seems to be, well, whether it's going to be for recreational use or medicinal, stigma, even after legalization, I think is going to be a huge issue, frankly, keeping people from a potential tool in the toolbox that might help them out. Yeah.
And I have buddies that were very successful who were part of the green culture, part of the cannabis culture as kids, grew up, became successful. I also have some dear friends that were victims of cannabis, and meaning that they're part of the 9% that Dr. Fandrew was talking about in episode 1. Cannabis is not a medicine that or a drug that people are readily addicted to. Is a very low percentage. I think she quoted 9% of the people that claim to have smoked or done cannabis have been addicted to it. So I do have acquaintances that fall into that. So I'm not naive to the fact that cannabis can hurt people. But when it comes to those guys, and over the last 40 years, watching them grow up and watching them become who they are today, I think they were self-medicating themselves, and I think they self-medicated themselves poorly, and they were doing it as non-medicinal users, of course. So that's what I'm saying about cannabis being a medicine, is that people do use it to self-medicate. They do use it to cope with their reality, and sometimes people just don't do it well.
No, and fair enough. And, I have teenage kids, and, I guess I'm the most conservative of the two of us, but even I have to admit, it's not good if anyone gets addicted to something, that can really interfere with their lives. But even I've got to admit, the more you read about whether it's medicinal or non-medicinal cannabis, it seems to be safer than, our most popular psychoactive drug, alcohol. So it's one of these things that, we should use with caution, but and I think that was one of the ideas behind this podcast is we've got to take a little bit of the stigma and the just out falseness about how dangerous, this plant is it's, absolutely use it with caution, but it's not terrible. It's not going to, light the towns on fire.
So, Trevor, have we wrapped up our first 5?
We've wrapped up the first 5.
I think so, man. Congratulations and well done, team.
Yeah.
Renee's sitting in the corner with his headphones on.
Yeah.
A little fist bump there, Renee. So let's talk about what we're doing in the future, Trevor. What is our plan? What are we doing with Reefer MEDness? Why should people listen to us for episode 6?
Well,
7.
We've done lots of other interesting things. We sent you on a road trip. And
I went on a road trip.
Yeah, not just up north. This one was down south. We've talked with some chemists. We've talked with some people who have some interesting apps to do with we getting the technology involved.
Well, Michelle and I, exactly. Michelle and I went couch surfing through Colorado. And I ended up going to a dispensary, and they do call them dispensaries. I'm sorry. They call them dispensaries in Colorado. And I interviewed a manager of a dispensary, and I was interviewing right in the middle. That's a good episode.
Yeah, no, there's lots of good stuff coming. So if you've enjoyed the first 5, tell your friends and make sure everyone checks out reefermedness.ca. That's our home on the web or all those social medias. We're usually at Reefer MEDness. And come back. We've got lots more. We're still excited.
Well, and the thing is that we're getting some suggestions from people from the internet. People are giving us feedback from Facebook, and we are listening and we are applying it. We've got, you said, right, you interviewed a chemist. We're even looking at, we grow cannabis all over Dauphin, right?
Yeah. Hemp plants are literally surround us right now.
Yeah, we're surrounded by cannabis. And what I found interesting in the interview we had with the hemp farmer is that they're actually growing sativa.
Yeah.
Low THC, high CBD sativa. I thought they were doing rubialis, but no, they're doing sativa. And it was like, oh, that's interesting. Something more to learn.
Kirk, what do episodes 1, 3, and 5 have in common?
What they have in common is a very, very wonderful lady and her business, Evolve Green.
Evolve Green.
They were our sole supporter of those episodes. Manitoba Solar Energy Program business, family-owned, wonderful, knowledgeable people, helped us immensely. We both have sexy roofs. Producing lots of margaritas. Yeah,
we couldn't have done it without her. Thank you, Lorena and Evolve Green, for episodes 1, 3, and 5.
Okay, so Trevor, we're gonna end episode 5 with how we started episode 0, and that's with Back to Dirt. One of the prides and joys of the Dauphin Valley, and that would be Kayla Lukey. Hang around, guys. Listen to this lady. She has grown as a songwriter, grown as a singer, grown as a performer. One of the favorites of our location, Kayla.
Let's listen to Kayla. We'll talk to you later.
Come back, guys.
Like the show? Let us know. We're Reefer MEDness on Instagram and Facebook, at Reefer MEDness on Twitter, or head over to the website at reefermed.ca to find out what we're all about and what's coming up next.
It's been weeks and weeks of traveling down long and winding roads, and I'm getting tired sleeping in my car all alone. So I pull into the nearest hotel vendor that I see, and I sit myself in a chair, say, bartender, will you please pour me a strong one, make it a gin on the rocks. Lacey, sir, I'm a singer and I got the night off. Well, if there are any cowboys here who'd like to take me for a ride, well, I'm here for one night only, and I'm here for a good time. Well, then before you know it, out of the corner of my eye, some tall, dark, handsome stranger starts taking up my size. He starts waltzing over, says, can I buy you a drink? I haven't seen you around these parts before, and I will simply say, pour me a strong one, make it a If there are any cowboys here who'd like to take me for a ride, well, I'm here for one night only, and I'm here for a good time. So he tipped his hat and he took my hand out onto the dance floor. I showed him a thing or two on how two-step really goes. He was fine at dancing, but he talked just a little too much. I said, listen boy, I'll tell you what a woman really wants. Pour me a strong one, make it a gin on the rocks. If you're sticking to the whiskey, you best just let it talk. And if you're good, if you know how to work that dance floor, I've been sleeping in my car, and I might let you take me home. Then before you know it, well, it's time for last call. You know how to fix my drinks, make them short, don't make them tall. And after a few more rounds, you'll see double the fun. Let's hop into your big old truck and just wait till you take me home. Pour me a strong one, make it a gin on the rocks. You're sticking to the whiskey, and I like the way you talk. You look like a cowboy I could take for a ride. Well, I'm here for one night only, and I'm here for a good time. Pour me a strong one, get a gin on the rocks. Well, you see, sir, I'm a singer, and I got the night off. Well, if there are any cowboys here who'd like to take me for a ride, well, I'm here for one night only, and